horses live in the moment. So that mindfulness kind of presence is what they can bring to leadership, and also that emotional control and regulation.
It immediately put me into a vulnerable space. I think that all of us, to some degree, wear a mask. With a horse, that mask was removed really quite quickly. She was able to see through that.
Hello, I'm Lisa Leong, and in this episode of This Working Life, they've let me out of the studio and into the wild. I wanted to test something out, something that's been growing in popularity in the last decade or so.
It marks something of a shift in this ideal of leaders.
Yet it's not without its critics.
Saying that perhaps this is just a novel management fad or fashion.
Have you guessed what it is yet? It's called horse-assisted leadership training. And I've been reading a lot about it and how it can develop our emotional intelligence and communication skills. And it turns out the connection between horses and leadership isn't so new.
There's an interesting cultural and linguistic link between, horses and management.
But more on that later. So, brimming with curiosity, I went out to try it for myself. We're going bush. Bracing the bitter cold and the rain, producer Rachel and I jumped in the car with Morven, our magnificent driver, and drove about 2 hours north of Melbourne to Kinglake. Can I just say that Rachel is completely dressed for the for skiing, and is wearing about 20 layers, so she's basically sweating at the back of the car at the moment.
I am overheating, but I'm also cautious. The wind chill factor is -3. What made you want to do an equine course to learn more about leadership and teams and how we relate to each other?
I think we just spend so much time in our heads and we try and think our way through being a better leader. And I'm always interested in learning about different perspectives, and so therefore I'm fascinated in what perspectives a horse might have on us, because you never know what you might unearth when you do something different and take yourself out of your comfort zone. So that's exactly what we're doing. I am not someone who is a particular horse lover or has done a lot of riding in the past. It's around lunchtime and we've just arrived at Karen Austenried's property, where she's been running equine leadership courses for the past 6 years. It's freezing and it's misty and sleeting outside, but here in the training room, it's nice and cosy. Before we head out to meet the horses, Karen briefs us on some basic horse safety and communication.
They don't go into flee mode or flight mode until they kind of, there's something over there, let's check it out. And they'll defer usually to the lead horse, and then that's all right, and everyone will go down again. So they can regulate their emotion in a blink of an eye, whereas humans, once we go up, it's really hard to come down, and it carries over into everything. And also, horses live in the moment, so that mindfulness kind of presence is what they can bring to leadership, and also that emotional control and regulation. They want clarity. They want you to be focused on what you're communicating. As soon as your mind drifts, they'll go, they're not on track, or they want you to be a good leader. So to be clear about the vision, to know how to communicate the vision to them well, and the main thing is they want to feel safe with you. So if you are clear, if you are direct with your vision, then they'll be like, fine.
All right, let's do this. Time to head out to meet some of the horses. So we're in a place called the arena, but the arena is actually sitting with this incredible outlook where we can see the tops of the trees. It's fine mist around us, there's fog, and behind us is the homestead, the warming place where we got a little bit of pumpkin soup before coming out here, but it is absolutely dreamy and kind of magical at the moment, like being on a magical mountain. So we're in a small group of 3 and we have to guide the horses through a small obstacle course. And turns out leading a 600 kilogram animal is pretty hard.
So you're leading?
I'm leading. Actually, I don't know what this one is. All right, I'm going to read the instructions.
Yes.
Are you ready for the instructions again?
Yes.
All right. This I found pretty tricky, understanding the instructions while trying to be in control of a horse and where it's going. So it's about listening to your team, weaving through the alleyway, zigzag through the obstacles, turn around at the end, come back to the beginning. When you get to the end, stop and back your horse up 3 steps. Sounds easy, right?
Yep, keep going. He's just testing you.
And
There we go.
good. Good, Freddie. Oh, so good. And left. Oh, nice. We were with the horses for just over half an hour, and I felt like I learned a lot in that time. More on this and what happens after our time with the horses later. But first, I had to ask Karen what motivated her to create this program.
So it was by sheer accident. So our property was destroyed in the 2009 bushfires, and I had a pony that was seriously burnt but survived, and my horse Duke. And during the course of recovery, he actually became quite dangerous. So he would just run through people and do different things like that. And then a program came to King Lake, and it was equine assisted therapy. And I thought it was therapy for my horse. So I thought, oh, fantastic, I can get my horse fixed. So I'm watching my Duke kind of just in the arena just going absolutely crazy because he was freaking out. And there was a dominoes effect. So the more he would run around, the more anxious I would get. And then it would so escalate. Anyway, after about 15 minutes, they said, you can go in there now, Karen. So I went in. And they said, and he was still running around, and they said to me, Karen, just breathe. And I said, I am breathing through gritted teeth. And they said, just take a nice deep breath in and just exhale and let all the air out again. And it's like, and then notice your jaw. And I felt then it was really, really tense because I was getting anxious because he was getting anxious. And he said, you just need to just breathe and relax. The horse is perfectly safe, you're perfectly safe. As soon as I took a few more long, deep breaths and started lowering my heart rate, Duke just went to a walk and kind of turned into me and came straight up to me and said, it's about bloody time. And then very quick realisation that he was literally responding to my anxiety and to my PTSD that was happening that I was completely unaware of. And then I saw the value of that emotional intelligence piece, and I thought, oh my God, leaders, being a leader myself, I thought people really need to manage their emotions and yet be authentic, because I knew horses had fantastic BS radars. And then I spent the next 2 years looking at all the different forms of EAL because I didn't want to become a therapist. And because I don't think it's simply about identifying things within yourself and developing that expanded awareness, that once you know they're there, then you can do something about it.
My name's Jamie McIver. I'm the general manager of an organisation called Addiction. We really focus on leadership development and cultural development using what we call smart action. So that's about, I guess, addressing the knowing-doing gap, which is where the real growth happens. The horse whisperer, as we call him, his name's Andrew Froggatt, and his wife Sam Froggatt. They lead an organisation in New Zealand. So he's an old friend of mine, and we were talking one day about our respective work, looking at how we grow leadership and leaders through experimentation. So he said, hey, why don't you come along and try it out?
And so what were you expecting?
Probably not a lot, but I guess there was a rawness about the experience. You're on the ground, you're not on the horse, you're on the ground, not quite eye to eye, because obviously they're a lot bigger than you. They're 600 kilograms. There was certainly a sense that there's something on the line, that you need to keep yourself safe, and that you're doing something that's, not something you do every day. So that sort of sensation was somewhat of a surprise. I think the other thing that surprised me, maybe bringing it back to a leadership context, was how quickly you get the feedback from a horse. I think that what we see in organisations, I've worked in large multinationals for most of my career, and a lot of what we're trying to do usually as leaders is change something, make it better, change the shape of it, put things together, etc. And sometimes it can take months or even years to really understand the impact that you're having. Humans compared to horses can be quite passive. So a lot of the resistance you'll get will be passive resistance. and it will take quite some time to understand what are the signals that I'm picking up here, what's going well, what's not, what do I need to do differently. With horses, it's completely different. With horses, you get immediate feedback. So if they don't like or don't buy into the line you're giving them, you get that back immediately through their resistance or, through them challenging you in many cases with what you're trying to do.
The horses are really wonderful in a way, learning how to lead differently, you could say, because they help us to attune to the affective, the embodied and the non-verbal forms of communication. So I'm Astrid Huopalainen, and I work as an assistant professor in the area of leadership for creativity at Aalto University in Finland.
And apparently you've been a bit of an amateur or hobby horse rider for the last 25 years. What is it about horses that can help us develop skills like communication, Astrid?
Yeah, the horses are really, really sort of wonderful in a way, learning us how to lead differently, you could say, because they help us to attune to the affective, the embodied and the non-verbal forms of communication that are really, really essential in how we communicate with them. So they really, I think, help us, develop these alternative ways of perceiving others. They help us to attune to the aspects that we perhaps dominantly overlook or take for granted in the human-centered workplaces or in the human-centered understandings of leadership as well. And these kind of training sessions, they often build on these exercises where humans try to connect with horses, not by riding them, but from the ground. So really trying to make contact with horses that know from before. And in this way, seeking to, attune to the perspective of the other, seeking to make the other sort of aware of your presence. And this is quite intriguing, This is not always easy because, the horses, they don't really always care about the verbal communication that much. It doesn't help that you say something or shout at them or so forth, but they really sort of require a different kind of attunement through the body, through the senses and through the presence. So they effectively, you could say that they mirror people's communication skills, and perhaps also you could talk about energy levels, because they are sensitive to our human body language and our presence and engagement with the surrounding world in a different way. So we can't really fake the sort of presence or our body language with the horses. And they sometimes really rightfully refuse to participate in our invitations to communicate with them. So that's also part of that dynamic, really.
And you wrote a fantastic piece of research, 2022 paper, More Than Human Leadership, studying leadership in horse-human relationships. And in that, you look at collaborating with a horse. And I love the fact that you received this piece of insight from an instructor. If you treat your horse as a tool, nothing will ever work. If you force the horse, you break your bond. The horse does nothing at all to consciously irritate the human. I found this very poignant and it really resonated with me. Do you want to go deeper on what the meaning of this is?
Yes, absolutely. I think it really has to do with, again, finding that way of, meeting the other so that you really you relate to the other. So the challenge is, of course, for us humans is that we create these leadership or leader-follower relationships with sentient animals who have their own agency and their own individuality, their own perspectives of the world. So we need to find respectful ways of creating, or communicating with them so that they accept, our invitation to communicate. And this offers us quite interesting opportunities of learning and reflection. So it's really, these subtle and aesthetic means for communication that matter really hugely. So that requires from us that we sort of genuinely seek to listen to and relate to the horse. And all of this nourishes these capabilities of relation building, interest and presence and attunement. And perhaps these are also quite important aspects of contemporary workplaces, even though we don't really perhaps always think about them as such.
Why are horses so perceptive? Why is non-verbal form of communication so important?
Well, historically, I mean, horses are these prey or flee animals, I would say in English, but they have been very sensitive to what happens in the environment and also to avoid, the attacks of predators and so forth. They really needed to listen into the environment traditionally when they, thousands and thousands of years ago. And still, they are sensitive to what happens in their surroundings. So they really constantly zoom in on what happens. They have very good sight backwards, and they might hear, all kinds of sounds that we as humans don't that easily pay attention to. And their reaction is to flee if they get scared. So really it's probably that sort of the history of the horse has made it so sensitive to these kinds of matters. But of course, horses today are domesticated and humans have domesticated them, and we've lived and shared, a joint history with horses for very, very long.
Speaking of this long joint history between us and horses, even the word manager is connected to horses. Is that right?
Yes, that's absolutely right. I mean, there's an interesting cultural and linguistic link between, horses and management. It is the Italian word maneggiare that the word management derives from, and it really sort of literally translates to this art of training and handling horses. But we focus on managing, people and resources and finances, and not so much horses, but definitely. And also, if we think symbolically, there are lots of representations of, leaders on their majestic horses that enhance the power of, of the leader, the symbolic power of the leader in that way. And there are even studies that have shown links between, stable cultures and women becoming leaders. So there are quite interesting work done in this area as well.
I believe that in leadership and in the workplace, that the energy that we have and our intentions, they ooze out of us, whether or not we are verbalising them, and therefore bringing awareness to our non-verbal presence, I think, is critical for leaders and their teams. What are your thoughts on this?
So it is something about when we connect, again, with the horses, or when we connect with others at the workplace, we are invited to move beyond these pure human cognition and language. It's about settling into our bodies, and this awareness of us being kind of whole embodied beings and not just cognitive brains coming to work might perhaps sound a bit trivial, but it really sort of reminds us about this importance of listening to our own bodies and also seeking to respect other people's moods and feelings. And perhaps you could say that leading and inspiring others really demands this sincere interest of who the other is. So in a way, if we listen closely, if we attune to the other, if we consider the perspective of the other, we might envisage more sustainable forms of leadership also in human workplaces, perhaps more caring and more humane forms of leadership. So I'm asking if, could we not consider learning to lead humans in the kind of caring and respectful way that we lead and follow horses, if we emphasize this relationality and presence and listening, because this kind of care and gentleness and respectful agenda that is found in the horse-human relationship in the best cases could perhaps also translate into human-centered workplaces and also the ways in which our everyday interactions at work could be done differently. So I do think that there's even more to be learned about these sensitive and attuned leadership practices for humans too, and what this could perhaps make for more ethical forms of leadership.
So back at the ranch, how did I go? Well, reflection time. I noticed that when I set an intention for when to stop and I was clear about my intention, then the horses would definitely stop with me. But when I was confused, when I wanted to leave myself open to all possibilities, which is kind of my natural state, then the horses would just keep on walking and they would be leading me off into the abyss. So that's something that I reflected on in terms of my own leadership. But I asked Karen how she thought I went leading the horses.
Well, you said it yourself that you knew that there was some expertise in your team, and so you were seeking that out, because a lot of leaders, for example, who had their own ego would never have done that. So that was really refreshing to see, that you could be humble enough as a leader to ask, because how many leaders go through going, I must find the answer myself, and then it could have been solved very quickly if they had sought the experience and expertise around them. So I really appreciated that, and how agile you were, how open-minded you were with having those discussions and then thinking about something else. And I really liked that you were just going with the flow. So that was lovely to see. And then the last bit was in the debrief when you said about the wording.
Yeah. So you had given us instructions and they were written down, and my lawyer brain was looking at the wording and there was some definitional, what I saw as issues, and it just confused me. So I couldn't move forward at all because I couldn't understand the instructions, and so I turned it to the team to say, I'm sure there's a practical way of interpreting this, it's just my brain won't go to the practical side. And so that was an invitation for them to help me understand those instructions.
Yeah, and I have had people say similar things in that particular session, because they just got so kind of overwhelmed with trying to work it out. They said I was almost non-functional. I had to step away and let someone else decipher that, which is great, but a lot of people wouldn't feel comfortable to do that. They would try and persevere. It's like we're not getting anywhere, we're stuck. So what do we do? And the thing is, just let it go for a day or an hour or 15 minutes, or take a breather and walk around the arena and come back in with a different perspective, and then maybe hand it over to someone else in the team to answer or decipher. As long as you're okay with their interpretations, that's fine.
Are there people who come away learning nothing from this exercise, unfortunately?
At the time, I felt they learnt nothing. They were a micromanager, and the horse was giving them that feedback. Their entire team was giving them that feedback. I was giving him that feedback. And even in the debriefing, the people were like literally black and white, saying we don't want to be micromanaged. We need some space. We need to be left alone to do our thing, and then hand it back to you.
What happens after the actual being in the arena? Is there any follow-up?
Yes, definitely. For all the corporates, I'll go in, have a meeting to see what their key objectives are, and how they're going to measure that, because a lot of the things that we do with the horses and the skills that you develop are intangibles. They're not, increase of sales straight away. It's about coherence of teams. It's about communication and clarity, or it can be measured in less mistakes, or in other kind of surveys or things. We'll have like a 4 L's of learning. So what did you love? What did you loathe? What would you want long for? And what you would leave out. And then I ask them to prioritise those, and then give me actions that they can implement. And then usually around about the 4-week mark or 6-week mark, I'll go back and say, okay, make sure they're SMART goals, that they can be achievable, and then go back in and say, hey, what are you up to? Have you managed to reach the goals? What were the blockages? And then go in and do that kind of coaching or follow-up. Yeah.
Thanks to my guests, to producers Rachel Bongiorno and Zoe Ferguson, and to sound engineer Kerry Dell. I'm Lisa Leong. Thanks for listening to This Working Life. And if you're enjoying the show, please share us with a friend or a colleague. This episode was produced on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Until next time, giddy up.
ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music, and more.
Just before we start, This episode contains some strong language and descriptions of violence.
It doesn't matter where you live in the world. I'm sure you've come across the odd racist poster or graffiti. But back in Perth in those years leading up to the fire at my family's restaurant, it was on a completely different level. I mean, like imagine entire streets, suburbs covered in racist posters, and they had these horrible messages like Asians out or racial war, white revolution, the only solution. And they didn't just target Asians. There were also racist posters about other people of colour and the Jewish community. And it didn't matter whether you tore them down, they'd come back the next day.
They caused a lot of distress, and we were bloody disgusted about it, and we went all out to find out who these people were.
In the mid-80s, right back when the posters first started appearing, David Parkinson was a detective in what was essentially WA Police's State Protection and Bodyguard Service.
We were called the secret squirrels and the spies and whatever.
When he saw the posters, he figured whoever was behind them could be a threat to the kind of visiting VIPs it was his job to protect. And so he started gathering intel.
Because the posters were politically motivated, it fell under our area.
David Parkinson noticed at the bottom of every poster something that was written on there. It was the name of a group, the Australian Nationalist Movement, or the A&M for short. And next to that, there was a postal address.
We took a warrant out on the post office to find out who the owner of the post office box was. He was the guy, the man behind the throne.
That man's name was Jack.
I was given the task to go and speak to Jack, which I did. I was probably the first police officer in WA to go and talk to him.
But before he spoke to Jack, he wanted to do a recce of the place where Jack lived in the Perth suburb of Gosnells. So the night before, he drove over in an unmarked car.
Just like a normal mum and dad vehicle.
And he parked the car somewhere away from the house and he just went for a jog.
I was wearing jogging gear. I had a jogging shoes, I had a pair of shorts, I had a singlet on, but I also had a bum bag with a 10 caliber Smith & Wesson handgun in. I wanted to find out what was there because we didn't know, quite simply.
As he jogged past the house, he noticed something pretty weird out the front.
There were sandbags on the front where a fence would be, which I thought was quite interesting.
It looked like some kind of battle fortification that would be more at home on the front lines of a war than in a suburban front yard.
And then I went in and retrieved a lost ball for my dog that didn't exist in his backyard.
He didn't see anything incriminating, but he had a bad feeling about the place. So then he went back the next day. But this time he noticed there were two men out on the front lawn and they were talking to Jack. So he pulled over, got out of his car and walked straight up to them.
In for a penny, in for a pound. I just went in, pulled my badge out, said I want to talk to Jack.
But it was the two other guys who made their presence felt first.
And then one of the person got very aggro and antagonistic towards me. He was all mouth. What are you doing here? What are you, the spies, are you? Which was like waving a red flag to a bull.
David's a pretty big guy, tall with broad shoulders, and he wasn't afraid of confrontation.
And I put him in his place very, very quickly because he was full of piss and wind. That's all he was. The other one, I was wary of him straight away, his body language and the way he was. I had him in my sight the whole time. A very menacing character.
Out of the three guys on the lawn, Jack was the shortest. He had this black hair with a side part, a well-groomed mustache, and he had this very strong sense of self-confidence.
And Jack, when I started talking to Jack, Jack tried to convert me. He was questioning why I was on the side of a corrupt government. He did not recognise our law. He did not recognise my authority.
So this conversation on the lawn at Jack's place happened in the mid-80s, which was a couple of years before the first restaurant fire bombings. David Parkinson was only investigating some racist posters, But now, he was getting pretty worried about what he was hearing. He realized that Jack wasn't just a racist. He was motivated by a much darker and more deeply held ideology. He was a neo-Nazi, and he was recruiting.
I had the hairs on the back of my head tingling because he was a very good orator, and I can see how he changed simple-minded people. When I got back to the office, I said, we've got a problem here. I said, these guys are mad, because it wasn't in our thought process that in Western Australia you would have an Adolf Hitler clone.
If you're wondering at this point who this man is, Jack Van Tongeren is Dutch-born, an ex-soldier and an office clerk.
A small man, Jack Van Tongeren led a small group of men comprising the core of the Australian nationalist movement. Van Tongeren preached a callous and confused doctrine of Aryan supremacy.
Well before the mysterious firebombing started, Jack Van Tongeren and his gang of supporters were stoking racist sentiment in Perth.
It's from here in the rather wet Perth suburb of Gosnells that the A&M spreads its message of racial purity and white supremacy.
His militaristic followers have been waging a graffiti war in Perth.
While the victims of racism continue to suffer in silence, it seems the perpetrators of racial conflict could be stepping up their campaign.
Now, it was up to the police to work out, was this gang just spreading hate? Or were they also burning down restaurants? This is Firebomb, the latest season of the ABC's Unravel podcast. Episode 2, The Posters. Growing up around my family's Chinese restaurant, I got to know the staff really well because I spent a lot of time there when I wasn't at school, when I wasn't being babysat. So I got to know the kitchen hands, the cooks, the waitresses. Speaking of which, here we go.
Oh no, you got photos. Oh my God.
Mitzi Chen and her family, I've known them all my life. It was funny hearing you saying you were quite quiet because if I remember, you were quite raucous back then with all the girls that were working at the restaurant because there was this crazy bunch of girls working on the floor with mum who seemed to party a lot afterwards because you were about 18, 19, I think, at that point.
Yeah, they dragged me out, Crispin. They made me go out with them.
Okay, right. We spent many family gatherings together. The children's table.
The dreaded Chinese children's table.
And she used to babysit my brother and I when we were kids.
So I think we've known each other a very long time.
When the man Lin was firebombed in September 1988, I mean, I was only 8 years old. So my memories of that time, they're all quite vague. Mitzi, however, she was older than me. She was about to finish high school back then. So I want to know what she remembers.
I heard about the fire attack at the Manlin from your mum, because I think she called my parents to let them know what had happened. I remember we drove by and was just like, wow, that's not a little fire. Like, they really tried to take out that restaurant. I was just like, shit. The middle part of the restaurant was just this black hole of nothingness. It was quite confronting to see.
For Mitzi, she was able to join the dots, and to her, it seemed clearly that it was part of a trend to what was happening in the streets. She had seen the A&M's racist posters all around the city, and she'd also seen the group's leader, Jack Van Tongeren, on the news.
Now, this sort of thing, if carried to extreme degrees, will in fact ruin the whole homogenous nature of Australia as a white European nation.
I think the media coverage made this situation worse.
Do you put these posters up?
I don't put them up.
You're telling me you don't put them up because you could be prosecuted. That's right, isn't it?
No, I'm telling you I don't put them up because I don't put them up.
And the journalists, maybe they thought they were trying to help by denouncing this group, but once the media started covering it, it's just suddenly this big, massive thing. All of a sudden there's a face to where all this hatred's coming from. That's the person you've got to fear and that you're worried about. So you don't want to forget what they look like.
By the end of 1988, 3 restaurants had already been firebombed. Mitzi felt like the whole Asian community was being targeted.
When the numbers started escalating, it was kind of like, okay, this is not a one-off firebomb that they're just trying to make a show of. It's like they're seriously targeting Chinese restaurants. I definitely feel like it was a message to us. It's kind of like, well, if you're not going to leave, then this is the stuff we're going to do to you.
Mitzi wasn't sure whether it was Jack Van Tongeren or his group, or if it was someone else inspired by them who was behind the attacks on the restaurants. But either way, it felt deeply personal for her. She worked at the Man Lin, but her dad was also working at another Chinese restaurant, a different one in another part of the city, and she was worried he could get hurt.
I remember my mum voicing her worries to my dad. Dad's like, I can't do anything about it. It's like, I can't not work because how are we going to feed the family type of thing? But it's frightening because I thought, I don't really want to lose my dad to racism or some sort of needless violence. You're just not sure what's going to happen.
There were people who had not just firebombed, but bricks thrown through the windows constantly. They'd repair them. The next day, the window was smashed. There were signs put up out the front of their house.
Gordon Hill was a Labor MP and a minister in the WA government at the time, and he was disturbed at the stories that were coming out.
People in the Asian community in particular came to see me concerned about the chanting that would happen where they'd walk down the street and people would be chanting at them and yelling at abuse, repeating the sort of lines that the Australian nationalist movement were presenting on their posters. Just intimidating stuff, and really that was frightening a lot of people.
Gordon was in a kind of unique position in the WA government at this time. He was the Minister for Multicultural and Ethnic Affairs, but he'd also previously been the Minister for the Police and Emergency Services. So, in theory, he was able to hear the community's concerns, but he also knew how to do something about them.
At the time, I was not satisfied with the police response to the way and how the police handled this whole issue.
As far as Gordon could tell, Jack Van Tongeren and the A&M, it was like there had been no real consequences for their racist poster campaign. I mean, to him, it was pretty obvious that it was either the A&M behind the firebombings or it was someone else inspired by them. But he also felt that the police weren't doing enough to put pressure on the group. And what surprised me is why he felt like that.
I've always held the view, and I've good reason because I've heard it from police officers, that there is a fair amount of racism in the police force, as there is in a lot of society, and sadly, but it came to the fore to me at that time. Just comments that were police officers made to me that were racist comments that were the sort of thing that you might hear from Jack Van Tongeren.
Gordon took his concerns straight to the police commissioner.
And said, what can we do about this? What is the police actually doing about these issues? It was always a matter of leave it to us, we're handling it. We've got people dealing with these issues and we'll take appropriate action when the need arises.
For Gordon, that didn't seem good enough. He told the commissioner that, look, you've got the A&M's name on all of the posters. You've got Jack Van Tongeren on TV, popping up all the time on all the channels, espousing his views. I mean, how hard is it to pinpoint this group and to disrupt their activities?
But unfortunately, the comment to me made by the police was we actually have to catch them in the process of putting up these posters. There's nothing much we can do about it until we actually catch them breaking the law. Well, it beggars belief, doesn't it, that police patrols, so many around the city, hadn't actually witnessed at some point these signs going up because they were going up everywhere.
I can't talk to the police commissioner about all of this because he's passed away. But it's important to say here that I don't think Gordon Hill is accusing the commissioner or any particular police officer of being racist. Overall, though, I think Gordon felt like the force was doing a half-hearted job. He was getting increasingly frustrated. With so many posters going up, why hadn't anyone caught the racists in the act? So one night, he got so fed up, he took matters into his own hands.
It was a rather dark night. I recall that really vividly. I was driving home down Kent Street in Victoria Park, and I noticed 3 people standing by a Main Roads Department sign with a bucket, painting equipment, etc. I knew straight away who it was. I knew straight away that was the A&M. I shone my headlights on the posters. There was an anti-Semitic poster. I think it was something about a Holocaust was a lie or something to that effect. I followed them, found them in the next street. I drove around the corner and stopped my car and put the window down and yelled out to them to come over to my vehicle. The 3 of them walked over behind a tree that was in a shadow of a streetlight, and they put their equipment down and then walked across the road. Jack Van Tongeren stood at the front of my car. A big bloke stood right next to my car door, and there was a 3rd person who stood at the back of my car.
Most people at this point would have just tried to get out of there. But Gordon Hill was losing his patience.
I was furious. I was so angry. I pointed to Van Tongeren and I recognised him because he'd been getting so much damn publicity. And I said, I know who you are. I got out of the car and the 3 of them followed me across the road. I crouched down in the dark. It was pretty stupid, I know, but I reached into their bag and I took out a poster, an anti-Asian poster. And I said, this is the evidence I need. And I walked off back to my car, and one of them yelled out, we're doing this for Australia, mate.
The next day, Gordon Hill took the evidence to the police.
They went to his house the following day to interview Van Tongeren because I'd given the evidence he was the man. At one point, Van Tongeren left the room and the police noticed on his desk was a book, Mein Kampf, and other right-wing paraphernalia. I think about a couple of months later, the matter went to the magistrate's court.
But there wasn't much the courts could do about it.
The magistrate imposed a fine of, I think it was $150 plus costs.
At this stage, there were no laws against racist intent in a poster. In fact, there were no laws against hate speech anywhere in Australia.
It was a penalty for defacing government property or something to that effect. So it was a slap on the wrist.
So basically, the gang got away with their postering, thanks to weak laws and, in the eyes of Gordon Hill, weak policing. So did racism in the police force help them get away with it? But one police officer we've been speaking to, Maury Tong, reacts strongly to that idea.
I never ever once saw any incidents of not stepping in and a proper police investigation being done. So the comment by the then minister, whoever he was just spurious. Just political motivation, nothing more, nothing less.
In any case, it wasn't Maury's job to stop people putting up posters. I mean, he was the head of the arson squad. But once the firebomb attack started in late 1988, it did become his job to catch the arsoners.
We discussed it as a team. We were a real team in Arson Squad. It wasn't just me sitting there. I had 3 other sergeants and good, experienced detectives. And we sat down and said, look, this has got to be linked to the A&M or something similar because these are racially motivated.
But not much useful evidence had come out of the fire scenes, and the arson squad was still struggling to make progress.
Every restaurant fire, all we were doing was getting evidence of arson. We weren't getting any evidence of identification.
It was infuriating for Maury, and the pressure was mounting.
The modus operandi is so similar, we know that one group or one person is responsible for it. There is suspicion, and way off in the far distance is proof.
When the new year rolled around, whoever was targeting Chinese restaurants dramatically stepped up their attacks. And in a space of just 2 weeks in January 1989, here's what happened. First, 3 restaurants were vandalized. Then, someone attempted to burn down another restaurant called the Ko Sing. Thankfully, it didn't catch fire. But then the firebombers struck again, Molotov cocktails were thrown at the Lingnan restaurant, causing nearly $40,000 damage. In total, that's 5 restaurants firebombed and more have been vandalized. The attacks on the Chinese community were coming non-stop, and it seemed pretty clear now that the motivations were racist. Perth was facing a wave of racist terror. Now, you'd think that'd be a pretty big story in the national news, but no, it wasn't. In fact, it wasn't even a big story in Perth.
So what are those dates? Are these the dates we're looking at?
Yeah, that's right.
All right, so...
Coasting on the 16th of January. And also the Lingnan restaurant in Mirrabooka. I spent hours at the library with ABC reporter Alex Mann trying to find coverage about what happened that January 1989.
Okay, what have you got there?
One paragraph in a paragraph of 3, one about the Lingnan restaurant, and then it goes back to a spillage of some chemicals by a truck. And that was the only mention of the Lingnan.
Wow.
That was on page after the world news.
It's like completely ignored. Like the significance of it is not at all conveyed through the coverage of the newspaper.
I wanted to tell our community side of the story. My parents were starting to understand that, and they even agreed to help me track down the owners of these other restaurants. Dad even suggested trying to contact these other owners through his old fish supplier. And because my Cantonese sucks, Mum helped me talk with some owners who weren't able to speak English well.
Hello, with ABC,佢 contact 過你
Some of the owners didn't want to talk.
Bye-bye. 唔好 隔咗咁耐 he said no because the time has gone past so long.
And others we found just dodged our calls entirely.
Hello?
She just hung up on you just then. She just declined the call. That's disappointing, but not surprising either. Really just sounds like a lot of the people from the 80s, from that particular generation, aren't really interested in talking about this at all. What are you supposed to do? It's fucking frustrating.
Why do you think they don't want to talk about it?
Because it brings up bad memories? Because maybe they're scared still? Because they don't think it's their job and they don't think they can do anything to change things. And sometimes they're just tired and they just want to rest. Enjoy the rest of their lives here and not try and stir shit up.
Is that what we're doing?
Yeah, I guess we are. We don't want to bug the Chinese restaurant owners anymore. I mean, it's frustrating because I really think their stories should be told, but if they don't want to talk about what happened or bring up those memories, I get it. Because early 1989, it was an intense time for them and for the rest of the Asian community in Perth. But what they didn't know was that things were about to get even worse. Because it was around this time that, just by chance, one cop got a scary insight into the world of Perth's racists.
Luck is a wonderful thing.
David Parkinson was that cop from the Intelligence and Protection Branch, the one who'd gone to visit Jack Van Tongeren years earlier.
It was one of my closest friends that I grew up with on the sheep station that I worked on.
That friend was calling from his dad's farm up in Bindoon, which was about an hour north of Perth.
He rang me and he said, do you know a person called John Van Blitterswyk? And I said, yes, I do.
John Van Blitterswyk was Jack's right-hand man, and he seemed to be a senior member of the A&M. He was that menacing-looking guy that David had met on the front lawn at Jack's, well before all the firebombing started.
Van Blitterswyk worried me right from the very first day. He was under my skin. There was something about him that I did not like.
So as David listened on the phone, his old friend gave him a vital tip-off.
He said he's in the Gin Gin pub with his couple of skinheads mouthing off how they're going to start a war with the Asians and the Jews and how they're going to wipe them out, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I said, really? And he said, yeah, they've got the property next to us. Well, bingo, it was like winning lotto. It really was.
From his old mate's property, he'd get a perfect view of the place. Now, David Parkinson wasn't involved in the investigation into the restaurant fires, but it was his job to be across any threats to VIPs or suggestions of political violence. So he was curious.
Basically, I wanted to get a good lie of the land because we had no information or anything was happening there. So I went to my mate's place, grabbed an old motorbike, went across to his boundary fence, and there was a pine plantation separating my friend's property and John Van Blizwick's property. So I had all the gear to, if something happened, if I was compromised. I had a backpack, I had jungle greens. I was suitably armed, obviously. I had a camera, and I went in, and amongst the pine plantation was a couple of big grass trees. So I secreted myself under one of them. And it was probably, apart from gaining the lie of the land, so to speak, it was boring as hell. Nothing occurred. I got bloody bitten by flies.
David packed up his stuff and left his hiding spot. And as he was driving home, he noticed a car parked on the side of the road, just opposite John Van Blitterswick's property.
There was a farm vehicle there. And when I'd finished doing what I was doing, I spoke to a fairly elderly bloke and gave him my phone number. And he rang me one night. And I remember it was a long weekend. It was bucketing down rain here in Perth. And he said, it sounds like there is a war going on in Van Blizwick's properties. He said the firearms, the gunfire is unbelievable. And I said, are we talking high calibre? He said, everything. He said, it's just been going for hours and hours.
To David Parkinson, this was a significant escalation. On one of the A&M's posters were the words, Asians out or racial war. But now it seemed like maybe they meant it.
So I rang my boss. I said, I better go up there. And he said, I can't spare you. Local coppers can go. Well, as it turned out, they couldn't.
So whatever the A&M was doing out there on that private property in Bindoon, for now it would remain a mystery. While in public, on the streets of Perth, it seemed like Jack Van Tongeren and his neo-Nazi followers were getting bolder.
And there was this hate in the community from this very small, diseased little faction. We didn't really think at that point that anything would happen to us.
In 1989, Helen Carroll was a humanities student at Curtin University in Perth.
I was a member of the Student Guild. I was motivated by political and social concerns.
And she lived in this share house with a couple of mates and her boyfriend.
So my household and I were kind of active in student protest movements.
They weren't Asian themselves, but their house was in a pretty multicultural suburb. Now, I didn't know this before I talked to Helen, but it turned out one of her favourite places to eat was actually my family's Chinese restaurant, the Man Lin.
The Man Lin was where we had many a takeaway and sat in. So, yeah.
Oh, right.
Yeah,
right.
So...
I mean, you would have probably met my mother then, I guess. She was usually the one who was manning it. Do you remember some of the food that you had there? What were some of your favourite dishes?
We loved the chow mein and, of course, sweet and sour honey kind of pork, which was just fabulous.
So when the restaurant was firebombed, Helen knew about it straight away.
That restaurant, when it was set on fire and firebombed, it didn't look like a fire had been through the building. It was destroyed. It was like a bomb had gone off. We saw the complete devastation. It was shocking to all of us that lived in the neighbourhood. But
It was what that restaurant symbolised to us that was so important, and this was people's livelihood.
For months leading up to the fire, someone had been plastering the whole area with racist A&M posters. She couldn't shake the feeling that the two things were connected.
I remember thinking at the time, was this a deliberate move to harm people, individuals, the people that owned the restaurant, or is this more of a twisted political statement?
With the unexplained fires and the spread of neo-Nazi propaganda, Helen and her housemates felt like the racists were winning.
And I think as a kind of a group decision in the household, we came to the view that we were not going to be letting that happen under our watch in our own backyard. It was offensive to us. So we decided that whenever we saw a poster go up, that we would either mark it out with pen or paint, or we'd do our very best to tear them down and destroy them.
And they weren't going to do it quietly.
As soon as we saw one, we would take it down without any qualms at all about who might be watching us as we were doing that. In fact, it was great. If people saw us do it, that was a good thing in the way I thought about it, because we wanted to publicly stand out against it.
But Helen and her flatmates didn't quite realise what they were up against, because it seems like someone had seen what they'd been doing to the posters. And one day in January 1989, they came for payback.
It was a very hot, typical Perth summer, early afternoon, beautiful weather.
Helen and her boyfriend, they had been celebrating her birthday, so they spent the day chilling out next to a fancy pool at the casino. But now they were coming home.
We were on our way back in his car. We came round the corner into Nottingham Street, where our house was, very close to the corner, and immediately knew there was something wrong. It was just the way the garden looked different. All of the front lawn was kind of crisped, and some bushes were burnt, and just thought, that's really strange. What's gone on here?
Then Helen saw her car.
I was looking at my car front on, and that whole side facing the street was caved in and blackened. And I went, really, what the hell's happened here?
Suddenly, the front door of the house burst open.
And I remember two of my housemates sort of falling out through the front door, down the front stairs, and going, oh my God, we got firebombed. And just not actually comprehending what they were saying, because really, why would you comprehend it? What does firebombing even mean? I didn't even realise what they meant by that. Everyone was really heightened. It was a tense and a real sense of we couldn't believe what had happened.
Slowly, the shock and confusion gave way to fear. She and her housemates, they had tried to push back the A&M by tearing down their posters. But now it looked like the A&M had retaliated with fire.
What if they come back again to try and finish off what they'd started? Because clearly they were aiming for the house and they wanted to do major damage. That scared us, because what we realised was that people were watching us and they knew where we lived. And that made a shift in our thinking.
Helen and her housemates called a house conference.
I think we sort of thought through what we should do, what we could do.
Helen decided it was time to back down.
We really needed to treat this quite carefully and perhaps go quiet for a while, not take down more posters, because we were very concerned that they were still watching us. They knew where we lived. It was a warning that they were sending to us. We were absolutely dead sure of that, and it scared us.
In January of 1989, it seemed like Jack Van Tongeren and his group were kind of unstoppable. But there were still a few people left in the city who were crazy or brave enough to run straight towards the danger instead of away from it.
There was a part of me that just thought, I don't care if I die, I'm going to go out swinging.
Today, Perth's president of the World Ninja Society spoke out about the fears in his community and the role of the lethal ninja fighters can play.
They dragged me around the corner, and that's when I heard the voice, we can't kill him here, we've got to get him out of here.
And whoever was firebombing the restaurants, they weren't done yet.
The latest attack happened just after 3 o'clock this morning, and police say it's the 6th explosion at a Perth Asian restaurant in less than 12 months.
The evidence that was obtained demonstrated a complete change in modus operandi. It now became protection of life.
This series is hosted and reported by me, Crispian Chan and Alex Mann. We've been making this podcast on Gadigal land and Wutjuk Noongar land. Our producer and researcher is Dunya Karagich. Research and fact-checking by Johnny Liu. Our theme and music composition is by Martin Peralta. Sound design and additional music by Simon Branthwaite. The commissioning editor was Alice Brennan, and our executive producer is Tim Roxburgh. To make sure you're the first to get the next episodes, follow the Unravel podcast. You can find it on the ABC Listen app.